Zionist, and at Exeter his research focuses on, among other things, Britain's awareness and complexity in population transfer during the Palestine Mandate. So we welcome both of you. We are giving each around 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes, and therefore we'll follow each other. And afterwards we have half an hour Q&A. All right? So here we go. We start with Adam, I think?
Yes.
Yes? All right. There you go.
The mic's not working.
Yeah, okay, so...
Yeah, so you have free hands.
Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, can everybody at the back hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Oh, well, that's a good start. Okay, so first of all, I'll just say where my initial interest in this topic came from, because someone was commenting to me as I arrived. It's quite difficult to find something new to say about the British Mandate. I mean, Professor Pappe has said that to me, so I'm quite excited with my project that I've got a decent idea. So it really started when I was reading a book by an writer called Padraig O'Malley called The Two-State Delusion. I don't know if anybody's read it, but he basically goes through the reasons why the solution to Israel and Palestine is not really going to work anymore. There's just no real agreement from the two sides on fulfilling it. And so the question really arose, why do so many members of the international community, so many countries and statesmen, continue to push for and, as a sense of political identity, keep pushing for this solution? And it's one of the things that keeps on coming up about the two-state solution is that it doesn't really take into account the events of 1948. It basically takes the 1967 war and the annexation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as its starting point. And so it doesn't really take into account the impact of this initial, the foundation of Israel and the Nakba, in the memories of both sides, how emotive it is, and the structures that it created for the conflict going forward. And this was particularly peculiar when you consider Britain continuing to support the two-state solution, as it was the witness for the foundation of these events. So everything from the development of the mandate to the suppression of the Arab revolt and the expulsion of the Palestinians was something they had seen, but it's not really something that is discussed in British politics, and it hasn't really seemed to make a difference to their support for this solution. So when thinking more clearly about how Britain, my initial idea for a PhD project was to look at the legacy of Palestine for Britain, but the fact that from that arose really the issue that it's not just peculiar Britain continues to have this support, and it's interesting that that really continues to be debated in Britain, because Britain has not been a world power, it's not been somebody who can really make that same impact in the Middle East or in world politics that it used to. And I'll bring up a quote by David Watkins, who says, an exceptional feature of the Arab-Israeli conflict is that it is as contested fiercely in Western countries as in the Middle East. So why this continues to be such a big issue for British politics, and yet this background of the mandate and 1948 aren't really a major part of it, well, until recently, really. So the majority of the discussion I found and source references remains with the Balfour Declaration, which is understandable, but it avoids and in some ways negates the crucial part that Britain played in maintaining the mandate and the impact this has had. Ian Westerson says, of course they often regretted it, they frequently tried to find ways around it, and in the end finally reneged on it, but for the majority of the time pretty much stuck to it. Were it not for the British, or more correctly the British Mandate, there could have been no State of Israel in 1948. Throughout the writings in certainly modern politics, you see that it does keep on being brought up and remains a source of tension between Israel and the Palestinians. I think there's remarks, of Ariel Sharon to the British ambassador in the early 90s, 2000s, stormed out to a meeting saying the British Mandate is over. So neither side hasn't much of an interest in what Britain has to say on the conflict. So the basis for the study lies in the question of the contemporary treatment and understanding and perspectives of Israel-Palestine from Britain, in particular the period of British administration leading to the establishment of Israel and the Nakba. So although there is a growing awareness, we've certainly had the issues with the Labour Party and the whole debate about anti-Semitism and Israel. So, there remains a big absence regarding the final period and the actual creation and administration of the mandate and the issue of the Palestinian refugees. So, and as I've said, this doesn't really follow because Britain was the witness and was the main power in the area. So more curiously maybe is that in light of the post-Zionist literature, which was really given more support to the Palestinian claims of expulsion and what was taking place during 1948, there hasn't really been a re-evaluation of Britain's role during that period. It's referenced quite a lot in lots of different works, but never really given a comprehensive overview. And so that's partly what I'm looking to examine. So in order to deal with those attitudes and understandings of the British on the ground, you have to sort of establish how they saw the Zionist movement. Because there were some supporters, but what they actually believed they were supporting or what they thought would take place needs to be established before you can really talk about how they were responding to events on the ground. So I broke this down into two forms, which is basically what the government in London was setting policy and how the administration on the ground was finding events. So basically examining what the administration on the ground was seeing, what they were reporting back to London, and how this was being interpreted by the people there and being translated into policy that they then received back. And so going from sort of the beginning of the mandate, you can find a lot of people like Israel Zangwill and Kane Wiseman at the Paris conferences were making these very grandiose statements about what the Zionist movement was hoping to achieve in terms of creating a state. But and in 1917, obviously you have the comments. You have comments by Edwin Montagu to the British cabinet writing his memo of the anti-Semitism of the present government, where his view of Zionism was, I assume that it means the Mohammedans and Christians are to make way for the Jews, and that the Jews should be put in all positions of preference and should be peculiarly associated with Palestine. But these are the positions. The Israel Zangwill and the Kane Wiseman's comments were sort of dismissed by the British government and Edwin Montagu. In the early days, Edwin Montagu was he was ignored. They made the Balfour Declaration. They carried on with the mandate. Again, with the Churchill White Paper, these views were sort of put to one side. These were people acting in the context of war and trying to pursue lots of different, trying to fulfill a lot of different policy requirements for how they were going to go forward during the peace. But a more detailed analysis of the situation in Palestine, the Zionist aims and intentions, found really comes out in 1923 after the publication of the Churchill White Paper. And it's a series of meetings between the first High Commissioner for Palestine, Herbert Samuel, and the Cabinet Committee for the Future of Palestine, responding to the early developments of the mandate, the riots, the Arab concerns, and basically what came out of the Churchill White Paper. And it's a series of 3 meetings, but it really does cover what they're starting to see in terms of what the Zionist movement is doing, how the Arabs are responding, and where they want to go forward. So these starts to look at economic, political, and the ideological spheres of what's starting to develop. And while they dismiss the Arab fears of the Zionist takeover as being what they expect to happen rather than what is actually going to happen, Lord Curzon, the Colonial Secretary, starts to say of the initially of the Jewish agency that was created to represent not just the Jews in Palestine but the Jews all over the world. This was set up specifically for them. There was no Arab equivalent. He starts to say of this, I cannot help feeling in my own mind that some difficulty may arise from the fact that there does seem to extend a certain degree of preference to a Jewish organisation representing, as Lord Peel has said, a great outside body, and without the same stake in the country as the locally resident population has. I can imagine that being made the source of a certain amount of feeling, perhaps grievance. But in more practical areas, they were starting to see a division of economic and social services, with Britain was largely providing the funding and the institutions for the Arabic parts of the population, while the Jews were developing their own largely separately. They were being financed largely separately. One of the, as Curzon does go to say, the main concern for Britain here is the financial cost of the mandate, so they're quite grateful that the Jews are doing that on their own. And immigration, obviously, and the economic sphere is obviously going to remain a very important development later on in how the Jews are able to start forming their own state institutions within the mandate. So it's important to really notice that it's being talked about and discussed and recognised early on. And so it's later on they start to talk about not just the amount of immigration, but the character of the immigrants who are coming and what their ambitions really are. Herbert Samuel characterised the Zionist movement again as a back to the land movement, idealistic, wishing to be amongst their own people, and not jeered at or worried. In addition to these cabinet meetings, a memo is circulated from Samuel by the Colonial Office, where he again identifies the Zionist movement, where he says, by the Zionist movement, I mean the movement to repopulate as much as possible of the country with Jews, to revive the Hebrew language and Jewish institutions, to emphasise the intellectual and spiritual sides of life, not less economic. There are some, indeed, among these Jews who are also animated by the ideal of a Jewish state, about which little is heard of that now distant goal. So really in these comments they are recognising that there is more to the movement than simply securing an economic footing, and that there are those who they consider outside, regardless of their previous statements that the leadership has made, that there are those with the ambitions of forming a state. So this really shows that quite outside what early advocates of the Zionist movement in Britain at the peace conferences were saying, they are seeing sort of the formations and the ambitions of the settlers who are coming to Palestine in 1923. And it's not just this. In other moments, the British seem to be complicit and supportive of the idea that they don't really need to deviate from the principles that they set out of absorptive capacity as a test for immigration, and thus linking it to sort of Jewish economic development, saying as long as you can support this number of people coming in, then we'll allow it. Curzon makes the comment, if the due amount of money is forthcoming, there is no reason why, over a space of time, which no doubt will be considerable, the Jewish population could not equal and finally overpass the Arabs. So there is a sense of, while they're not promising that they will force a Jewish state, they're not saying that we will give preferences to the Arabs in order preferences to the Jews that will allow them to dominate the Arab population. They are saying maybe over the natural course of time, without us really doing anything, the Jews under their own power can come to form a majority, in which case it will be a democratic decision to create a Jewish state in Palestine. So not really willing to do it themselves, but they're quite happy they are complicit in simply allowing the Jews to develop on their own in this direction, and they are aware of this intent and that it is a possibility. In the later years of the mandate, officials on the ground provide further evidence of these initial assessments, and while it's worth remembering that there was a lot of documented hostility of British officers and officials to the Zionist movement, their observations are pretty useful, as I've said at the beginning, in what they were seeing and what they were reporting back to the government. So in the wake of the 1929 riots, the former advisor to Herbert Samuel, Ernst Richmond, commented, the Jews were working for the revival of a Jewish state, and that the Jewish national home was only a step in that direction. Jews came to Palestine in order to live as Jews and not as Palestinians, integrated in an Arab region. The only way to maintain Zionism against the Arabs was by force. So while the state had been denied by the British in the Churchill White Paper, and at least publicly by Zionist leaders, this once again bears a reference to the observations made of the settlers in the Cabinet Committee of 1923. In an overview of the British attitude during 1930s, Evyatar Freisel summarises the British understanding of the political inclination of the Zionist movement, saying what seemed to touch a raw nerve in British perceptions was the active, creative side of Jewish life, or of the Zionist enterprise in Palestine, which inevitably involved also the political aspirations of Zionism. The attitude of many British vis-à-vis Zionism was not one of indifference or apathy, as it is mentioned sometimes as typical of British settlers and officials in the colonial service towards the natives. The opposite is true. Many of them were very much aware of the aspirations of the Zionist movement, but it was a negative or even hostile awareness. So once we move into the 1930s, the goal of the state becomes much more explicit. Originally people had been told not to discuss it publicly and not. So the Zionist willingness, which they were initially willing to accept a legislative council with the Arabs in which the parity was withdrawn, and the question of partition and population sizes within separate states in while some were advocating partition, became a much more public dispute. So as I noted at the beginning that there was little really study of Britain with regards to the revised literature and everything that has come out about the expulsions and the idea of population transfer in Zionist ideology. And it is not just remarkable that Britain was a witness, but that in the literature it is actually talked about, not in a comprehensive sense, but meetings with very high-ranking British officials. And obviously what the officers and officials on the ground were seeing is commented on in bits and pieces throughout a lot of academic work, but has not really been put together. So the discussions of transfer have remained consistent throughout the mandate, and No Masalha's work gives an overview of the plans and thoughts about population that, from the Zionist perspective, that took place over the mandate. And in some areas it shows that it overlaps with, as I said, senior British officials. And so it's the British perspective that remains explored, and they're putting that in the context of what I'm showing with their understanding of Zionism is really what the focus of the study is going to be. So a lot of some of the early allusions that you start to see even come from Churchill in the early 1920s, where he comments that the Zionists are taking transfer for granted. But by 1930, explicit talks were taking place with the Prime Minister and the Colonial Office by Wiseman, who gives an account of the meeting where he indicates that both the Colonial Secretary and the Undersecretary did discuss encouraging transfer or exchange, not specifically expulsion. These were talks about providing incentives for Palestinians to leave, or voluntary and compulsory transfer. This is early days when the Zionist movement is still trying to establish itself, and they're talking about which areas of the Middle East they can go to, and eventually a formal plan is put together and presented to the Colonial Secretary, encouraging transfer to Transjordan. While it's rejected, you can't really say that the British at this point do not know that this is something that the Zionists are thinking about, that this has been put to senior members of the British cabinet. In fact, the Colonial Secretary's wife, who was an avid diarist, noted in 1929, "I admire Jews and dislike Arabs, but the Zionist movement seems to me to be a gross violation of the right of the native to remain where he was born, if there is such a right." So this, as I said, this takes place in the context of smaller local movements of population that were taking place during land purchases, where Palestinian farmers were being moved off the land as the Zionists purchased the land. So throughout the period, there are these plans or ideas are being put forward to the different committees, the white papers and the commissions that the British are sending to try and resolve the situation. And it comes out most clearly in the 1937 Royal Commission, which supported partition and provided a degree of legitimacy to the idea of transfer and population exchanges in order to make slightly more to make the demographics in each state more practical. And the most explicit really comments in support of transfer from the British comes from the Labour Party declaration in 1944, which it stated, "Let the Arabs be encouraged to move out as the Jews move in." So perhaps the best sort of analysis of how the British really relate to the conflict comes with a very focused study on 1948 from an academic called Rosemary B. Esbar, in which she looks specifically at the period of expulsion from 1947 to 1948, and very closely at what the different British forces and British administrators and government officials were seeing, and what their actual understanding of the situation during that year-long period was. So in the first instance in 1948, the British authorities had become fully aware of the military strength of the Zionist militias. This is not just sort of what the post-Zionist literature has said in saying the Zionists were actually stronger than a lot of the Arab opposition they faced. This is reporting that the British were very much aware of this. They weren't, as some earlier writings on the British response have said, they weren't just expecting the Arabs to sweep in. The British officers of the Middle East have reported that Zionist forces held numerical and operational military superiority over Palestinian, Arab and foreign Arab forces in Palestine. This had begun to take shape really in the aftermath of the Arab revolts, and there had been a quiet acquiescence to the formation of the Zionist militias and to their armaments from the beginning of the mandate. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Medhurst stated, The Jewish army is there to enforce by illegal means the policy they want to pursue, gradually to extend their territory by displacing the Arabs. This is corroborated by a general officer commanding John Darcy, stating that if the British withdrew, the Jews would first consolidate themselves in their own areas and extend their domination where they wanted to go, where in fact the good land is. However, in the build-up to 1948, there was an expectation of a Zionist victory, and an awareness that the aim would not simply be the defence of partition zones, but an effort at conquest as the fighting progressed. Next, a key element in understanding these issues, both in 1948 and the earlier mandate, is the problem in receiving clear instructions and communication between the central authorities in London and the officers and officials on the ground. Dr. Esbo comments that the military's interpretation of orders during the evacuation could conflict with both High Commissioners and London's policy. A complex command structure fostered competing interests in British military decision-making, which at times pitted the military command in Palestine against both London and the Mandate civil government itself. The reports of fighting and expulsions communicated to London received little feedback or were ignored, while those responsible for the withdrawal were often left to respond to developments in an ad hoc manner. Sir Gordon Macmillan comments, frustrated from the lack of responsiveness of London to the escalating conflict, His Majesty's government had let the whole thing fall apart badly from lack of knowledge and being out of touch with the local situation. And this is really just an assessment of what was happening in 1948, but you receive these same comments of a lack of clear policy direction and frustration from the local administration or going back throughout the full mandate. So again, what I'm examining is how there's this question of communication. We've seen how British officials on the ground are seeing things and how London is interpreting them, and how this really tries to answer the question of why Britain continued in its policies and what it knew about what the consequences of its policies. So these competing interests, perspectives and pressures combined and exacerbated communication and policy difficulties. As with the other themes, and as I've said, they do have their roots really in the earlier mandate. So that's hopefully just a brief examination of what my whole study is going to be about. 20 minutes and I'm continuing to gather evidence, but so far I'm finding quite a lot of comments coming out of the primary sources of officials and again very senior members of the British cabinet as to what was taking place in Palestine and the discussions that they were having. So hopefully by the end of this I'll be able to re-examine the mandatory period, more closely focused on Britain in the context of other post-Zionist literature. I'm going to look at the awareness of the need for the awareness and the existence of an official line of thought and discourse regarding form of population transfer, because this was not. If I have time in my study, because this is, you can go on for you can expand quite a lot on British involvement, but within Britain's own imperial sense, population transfer had been utilised. It was not Palestine was not the only settler colony they'd overseen, and which could be a study in and of itself. But you have in the aftermath of the First World War, an issue that keeps on being referenced is the population between Greece and Turkey, which everybody saw as a precedent. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, you have massive shifts of population in Europe as German populations are expelled from the newly liberated areas. So this is not something that is considered abnormal in Britain's context. It is even in the aftermath of the First World War, with issues of self-determination and the rights of minorities and other native populations coming up. This is something which is very much within the colonial mindset. So Britain's attitude to it is not exactly going to be. It's only problematic in terms of their strategic position in the Middle East. It's not something that's necessarily out of their experience. And finally, we'll be looking at the extent to which Britain was consciously enabling this policy. As we've seen at the beginning, they did feel that in the long term there was a possibility that the Jews on their own could create the circumstances for a state without Britain having to force the situation, which they really did not want to do as the 1930s progressed, and their international situation became more dire. So I hope that's been of interest. Thank you.
So thanks very much. much, Adam. We'll come back to you, I'm pretty sure. We've got loads of questions. We now leave stage for Sabrin. So please start with it.
Yeah, so I'm going to look at something completely different because I come from a completely different subject. I'm actually not dealing with history in the first place. I'm coming from, I'm doing a PhD in creative writing. And I'm doing history as my second subject with Professor Ilan Pappe. So I came here 2 years ago, I don't know, probably someone was here, and I was reading from my book, and I was optimistically thinking that I was going to finish my book in 6 months, max a year. The things got a bit complex, and my book became a PhD. The question is, why didn't I just keep on writing my book? The fact is that when you write a book about Palestine, you're not just writing a book. You're dealing with issues and problems that need to be explored in a deeper way. You just can't put words on a page and get away with it. Every single word has a weight. It's a heavy word, every single word, and you can't just take it lightly. So it became a PhD project because I felt I needed to explore much more before being able to put everything on the page. So to clarify what a PhD in creative writing means, because I know that it's not as clear, because doing a PhD in science, doing a PhD in history is clearer, but how can you do a PhD in creative writing? So it's called practice-led PhD. That means that you have issues to explore and questions to answer, but you don't explore them and answer them through theories and archives or labs, but you actually do something practical, something artistical. So you'd say, I will be able to answer this question through arts. In my case, it's writing, but there are people who are doing their PhD, practice-led PhD in ceramics or in dance. We believe that there are questions that can be answered just through art. This is what a practice-led PhD is. So my question, when I decided to transform my book in a PhD, I realized that the question I was asking to myself were answerable just through the actual practice of my writing. And Ilan Pappe was agreed with that. He actually knows a lot about literature. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yes,
He's an expert of everything. Sometimes I feel like, sometimes I feel like, oh my God, whatever I say, he knows. They're like, okay, so he is a great lover and expert of literature, and he was really, really keen about this project because he was saying it's an interesting way to approach history from a different point of view. So that was kind of an introduction. So I'm writing a family memoir who is based on my mother story. So I am half Italian and half Palestinian. My father is the Palestinian part. My mother is the Italian part. And my mother moved to Palestine with 2 children when she was 22, and we are speaking about the 80s, and I was born during the first Intifada. So my mother was pregnant and delivered me during the first Intifada, so you can understand kind of the situation. So I'm writing her experience as an Italian woman growing a family in the 80s in Palestine. She then was expelled in 1991, so we moved back to Italy. When I say was expelled, it was expelled by the Israeli government, of course. My book is a non-fiction family memoir. So the reason why I decided to do a PhD is because I realized when I was writing that there were big implications when you write a non-fiction book. The first one is because when you write fiction, you can write whatever you want and get away with mostly everything, and then say, oh, but it's fiction, it's not real. With non-fiction, you can't do that, because if you declare this is my family memoir, you just can't make up stuff. So the first reason was that I can't just make up events or facts. I have to be real and true to what happened. The other reason why I decided to explore more my book is because non-fiction requires accuracy, to be accurate. For two reasons. The one, what we said before, and that you are dealing with actual facts, so you can't create a fiction around it. And the second reason, I would like to make an example about making up facts of your own memoir. So I don't know if you ever heard about James Frey. So he wrote an autobiography, so it was just his life, and he was set in the States, and it was a massive bestseller because he was dealing with, drug addiction, so many people took him as an example, until someone found out that he made up mainly everything. So he was saying that he spent 3 years in prisons, and they found out that he'd never been arrested. So that has massive consequences. That went to Oprah night, and Oprah was was a scandal because Oprah in the States, she has a book club, and she was the one saying to all Americans, oh, you have to read this book because it's inspirational, it's struggling with your life and going the other way and be victorious. And then when they found out it was all fake, she was like, oh, you tricked me, it was all fake, it was a massive scandal. But it doesn't have any historical implication, it was just his life. And here we go to the second layers of problem when you write a non-fiction. What happens if you make up events that have historical correlation? So another example is, actually, I will go with a quote first. So there is a really interesting article that you can find on The Guardian online from the 12th February 2018, so pretty recent, by, I hope to pronounce her name correctly. So the writer is Aida Edemarian, and the title of the article is A Stab at Truth, My Grandmother and the Problem with Family History. So she writes, in describing the specific detail of my grandmother's life, her daily routines, I began to see how an individual and a remarkable family existence could illuminate a specific historical context and a way of being. So if you make up events of your own life, you can get away with that because after all, what the consequences of your lying is just on your own life. But what happens if you fictionalize events that are connected with history? Another example was pretty famous at the time as well, was by a writer called Misha, a Holocaust memoir, saying that her parents were in a camp during the Holocaust, and she was a little girl, and she was trying to find them and nearly cross all Europe to find them. So it was another massive bestseller. She said that was all true until someone found out that was not. So you can see the difference, right? While the other guy was lying about being in prison 3 years instead of not being in prison, she was lying about her parents being in a camp. He was lying about historical events. And the scandal that happened after that was much bigger, to the point that the publisher of this Misha de Fonseca actually asked for a return of $22.5 million for being tricked into something that the publisher thought was a factual memoir, and instead was all made up. So this is all to say that when you write something that has historical implication, you can't do that lightly. You can't just write whatever you want and then say, oh, but it's just writing. It's not. It's been read, and it influenced the public opinion and has consequences on it. So as to summarize, when you write family histories, you have two lines of problem. One that is common to all non-fiction and all memoirs, and it's mainly it's because memoirs deal with the unreliability of their raw material. I mean, memories. We all know that memories are never a plain. You never remember plain facts when you remember something. You actually remember an arrangement of these facts, a narrative of these facts. So every time you deal with memories, you will find gaps, you will find controversial memory, contradictory memory, staged memory. Because someone can have an idea of him or herself and will not like to give up to the actual facts, but rather the idea that he or she has of these facts. And I can tell you this happens so much with families. Like, yeah, we will go there. And the other problem that is typical for historical memoir is that when you talk about history, whose history you are talking about, right? Because we have to make a difference. So when you write about history, it's easier if you deal with accepted and a mainstream history where there is a lot of documentation, a lot of documents, a lot of source, a lot of material in the archives. But what happens when you write about controversial and not accepted history, or when you deal with history of marginal people? So I think that when we talk about Palestine, we are not talking about accepted history, do we? Like, as Adam was saying, like, there is so much to dig still to understand how things actually went, what actually happened. So if you put together the fact that you are writing with memories that are not reliable, and then you put on top of that the fact that you're working with historical facts that are not widely accepted or widely explored, you can understand why writing a book that puts these two things together can be really, really hard. So, and that came my other big question. So if I can't access, traditional material to retrace my family history, and I don't have archives, I don't have documents, what do I do? So a good answer, a good help came from the theory of Mark Bloch and Carlo Ginzburg. They are two famous historians. By the way, I have a long bibliography if you want to know more books. So I would say Mark Bloch and Carlo Ginzburg, they explore two concepts, slightly different but kind of. So they talk about unintentional evidence or uncontrolled elements. By that, they mean that when you can't find history in what you expect to be the traditional document and sources, you still can find history coming out from unexpected sources. Carlo Ginzburg speaks more about literature, about artifacts, about piece of art, and especially he talks about folklore. And this is the whole point of my PhD. I really believe that folklore can help to fill the gaps of memories and historical documents, or when there are not other kind of historical documents, to understand more or less what happened in a specific historical period. I'm not the first one thinking about that, but I think it has huge creative potential if you put folklore with actual creative writing, because folklore is a form of art. So before going on and look at my book, I would like to make another distinction, and I hope it's not wrong, because I'm not an historian, so I'm kind of not 100% sure of the historical terminology. But in a beautiful book that is entitled Nakba, it's pretty new. I can give you the all the reference if you want to read it, but it's really, really good. It's a series of essays. they make in one of they say there is this really good difference. They make this difference between history and heritage. So history is what we usually think about traditional history. So it's mainly based on archaeological and documentary events, and it's usually chronological and structured, and it's usually from a subject to an object. So it's a subject that study a clear object. And the difference is that heritage instead, it's not a way of studying something, but it's a way of being in rather than knowing the context. And it usually takes the form of ritual or myth, and it's usually the form that history takes for people who are living it. So if you go outside right now and then you ask someone their opinion about the historical event they're living, they will probably, it's not something that comes straightforward. But if you ask them about their rituals, their habits of today, they will probably be able to answer. And that is history. That in 10 years' time will be history. So it's really interesting to say that we have taught, I was taught since primary school that history is just documents, history is just archaeological evidence, but there is a whole sector of history that is the history of everyday people that can be analyzed and is important, especially when it comes to marginal groups, because that's sometimes is the only history they have. To go back to my family memoir, so as I said, I'm dealing with Palestine in the 80s. I'm actually looking at a bit earlier and a bit after, but the main focus is in the 80s. And I have to deal with those historical events. So my problem is that, as I think every family, I kind of interview all my family members and no one has the same version of it. Not just that, but they fight against each other for which has the best version of the facts. And of course the truth is always in the middle, but I have just one book to write. I can't write 24 books for every single version. Then on top of that, you think about I have five uncles and aunts, 20 cousins. Like Palestinian families are not small. Okay, so it's really hard to put together all their versions. And on top of that, my problem is that the historical events of the 80s are not forward. It's not just black and white is happening. There is still a lot during the first Intifada that need to explore, especially if you look at it from a woman point of view. That's another big problem for me, because there is controversial ideas and opposite ideas of the roles of women during the first Intifada. So to be consistent with what I said, what I used to understand a bit more what was going on in the 80s, I went and looked at the folklore that was used in the 80s, that was practiced in the 80s. So I will read from one of the essays I wrote recently, and I say, forms of folklore are still highly valued and used daily. Above all, folk songs, jokes, proverbs and nursery rhymes. In addition to these forms of folklore that rely on a text and therefore can be analyzed as a normal historical document, there are other non-textual forms of folklore. Due to their high relevance in the daily life of Palestinians, they also need to be considered. Like food, included the symbolic attachment to traditional Palestinian ingredients, popular music and dance, embroideries and other craft. So to make a quick example about food, for example, the most symbolic food are the olive tree and the sabr. Sabr is a prickly pear, I think in English. Yeah. Both are highly used in the preparation of food and have been on the territory for centuries. The sabr, which literally means patience and ability to resist, due to the adaptability of the cactus, is now symbol of the Palestinian steadfastness.
Sorry, no, continue.
Oh, sorry.
There's just
It's 5 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. In the occupied land. For many parents, naming their boy Sabr and their girl Sabrin was a symbol to commitment to the land, a fruit able to grow against adverse conditions. Prof. Kanana, Sharif Kanana is one of the most important folklorists of Palestinian folklore, shared with me a little story to illustrate me the power of the symbol of Sabr, as well as the Palestinian traditional sense of humor. So when he asked one of the woman storyteller with whom he was work, and who was named Sabrin, if the reason behind her name was indeed a political one, this woman answered back, "No, it's because I am the seventh daughter." So not only are these forms more used and therefore more meaningful for the current Palestinian society, but they are the way my mother, an Italian woman, learned about and got integrated into her new environment. For example, my mother's first friendship with Arab women, Palestinian women, and her relationship with her mother-in-law developed through the learning of traditional recipes. Or also, one of her first contact with the Palestinian culture was through the traditional dances, which she learned and performed when she was still in Italy. Finally, my mother learned Arabic from children's rhymes and stories when working in a kindergarten in Ramallah. One of her favorite nursery rhymes was later adapted into a successful political song during the First Intifada. By inserting these forms of folklore in my writing, I will then work on 3 different levels. I will strengthen my description of the Palestinian culture and history. I will position my mother and my family's story in relation to this tradition, and I will be able to put this tradition in connection with historical events. That's it. I can, if you like, what I would like to do now, if we have time, is read a little piece from my book, and then we can comment it in the Q&A. Is that alright?
You've got 3 minutes, so.
Yeah, it should be.
Give you 3 more.
It should be 3 minutes.
Yeah,
honest.
yeah, go on, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these come from the second chapter of my book. It's actually about my father's childhood. I have changed all the names in my book at the moment because my family, on top of not agree with each other about the version of the story, they are also really shy about it. They don't really want to be named, but you know they are my family, so it's okay. So what I call Rami is actually my father, is a 10-year-old boy, and we are in 1967, in the June War of 1967. And this is kind of what happened after, and the point of view of my father. So what confused Rami more than anything else, it was how he was supposed to behave with the new rulers. When his father discovered that he became friends with the soldier guarding the building in front of their home, Rami experienced one of the worst silences his father could produce, echoed by his mother's stormy reaction. But then his parents made him behave all nice and polite when the new people came to buy meat at their butchery. And then came all the identity card changing and switching and declaring. They were lined up in the main square of the town, in front of the church, and they were all waiting for their turn to declare who they were and what they believed in. Rami started trembling. His school was a Catholic school, but his mother kept bringing them to the Greek church. His father instead preferred some of the Protestant groups. They were more practical, less worldly, a good way to compromise between his wife's deep faith and his own useful empiricism. So when his turn approached, Rami didn't really know what to say. He never really thought about it. For him, any was good. He thought about declaring his passion for the Greek style, for its dramatic ceremonies, but it was not a proper vocation. He thought about his father's groups, which at least require shorter sessions. But he also really liked his teachers. When his turn came, the new authority made everything simpler or more complicated. Christian or Muslim? The soldier asked. Rami, instead of rejoicing in front of the general label of Christian, was taken by the panic of yet another option. He never really considered being Muslim, but many of his friends were. So how could he discard the complexity of his internal eternal faith in a matter of seconds? Could he come back another day, reflect on it a bit more, try them all and then decide? And what about his father? Could he say, neither thank you? Or what about Ibrahim, his classmate with Muslim mother and a Christian father? What would he have said? Christian, cut short his mother, solving centuries of religious debates in favor of family affiliation. But Rami was never convinced of this a new identity card. It had another state on it, even if he was still living in the same place. It also had an alphabet Rami didn't know how to read. And there was that Christian there, so general to the truth and yet so precise to cut through the reality. Rami and all the people under the new domination soon found out that it was not just a matter of God, that there were some really earthly privileges coming with being Christian that didn't come with being Muslim. Better business, shorter queues at the checkpoints, softer treatments in prison. People, who probably knew even before but didn't really pay much attention to it, started to ask their neighbors what they got in their IDs. Even Rami and his friends play with it like a pack of trading cards. You got Muslim, I'm sorry for you. I can give you my Christian one if you can give me your sweets for the rest of the year. But if for Rami and his friends was just a matter of annual supplies of sweets, the new word on people's IDs brought into the town a new subtle awareness of difference. They said it was just a word that had no value, that it didn't matter for them. They knew who they really were. But in the long run, the generality yet preciseness of that word drew another invisible border, ambiguous, unclear, often trespassed, but still a border. If you didn't pay attention, you wouldn't have noticed it. But it was in the little things that changes hid. Like in those dreams where everything looks exactly like reality, but there are some anomalies that betray where you really are. People start to talk slower and more careful along the town streets. Rami couldn't go anymore to look after his father's animals on the hills. His mother needed to find someone else to buy the milk from. And in September, some desks at school were empty.
Thank you, Sabrin. Very emotive and very kind of rich, actually enriching. But we'll have to add, I'm a bit more Arabic than you, but so her name is Sabrin, and it means we are patient. So, but funny, I've never looked much into it, but now that you said it, in fact, yeah, it is. Right. So, thanks once again. I've got a few questions, but I prefer that you please start. Probably I can have them and afterwards. But if there is no questions, probably I start. So up to you. Please just make them know who you are and whom you are asking, Adam or Sabrin or both. Do you have any question? Yeah, right. So I go for it.
I was going to ask, I mean, it's been really interesting, but it's so disparate. I feel awkward asking a question to Adam, which kind of sets aside everything you've been talking about. I can't do much about that. I was going to ask Adam about, you were talking about the relationship with the British and the Mandate and so on. And I was wondering about the extent. There are various things I was going to ask about the quality of the colonial secretary, which I don't think is very high. But I wanted to know about the people on the ground. How did they come to be officials and so on? Were they just on the colonial service and got allocated to India one year and then Palestine the next? And the degree to which they took sides. because I remember reading, I was quite shocked by this incident during the Palestinian revolt when I think it was Lord Wingate was training Haganah soldiers in how to interrogate, and as part of this lesson, he shot in cold blood, shot dead a Palestinian prisoner. I mean, this is how the British Empire was built, I suppose. But I mean, it does illustrate the fact that this man was, Wingate was a passionate Zionist. I mean, or did he just kill people all the time? And so I wondered about, if you could say a bit about the divisions, if you like, within the British people who were there.
Well, to start from your first question, most of them came from the colonial service, and it's a frequent problem that obviously there was a difference in the way colonialism was practiced in India as to how it was practiced in the British mandates. This is an idea we have of there being India being colonialism and the British mandate being settler colonialism. The Zionist movement came there to stay and build its own presence, so they weren't really suited to dealing with these different groups. And as is commented, I wouldn't really say the British forces necessarily took sides. There was a great deal of racism and anti-Semitism felt to all sides, and particularly in terms of the anti-Semitism, it is, they criticised the Jews for being Bolsheviks, they criticised them for being Catholics. There's really no winning for that side of the argument. Again, for the individual, there are a lot of people who were pro-Zionist, but again, there's also the issue that I feel they were probably more pro-British than anything else. It's perhaps a boring argument, but in the terms of people, the further closer to the ground you get, as they say, Lord Wingate was running these, was training the Haganah militias and the Jewish settlement police. I'd say for people on the ground, it is very much their individual experience. When you go up to 1948, there are instances of attacks. There's dislike of the Arabs. There is, they are giving, in some cases, property is handed over to both sides. Information is given to both sides from the forces as they withdraw. In 1936, they are experiencing guerrilla attacks from the Arabs, and when you get past 1939 and they start experiencing terrorist attacks from the Jewish militias, they start responding in that sort of way. So the people on the ground who maybe don't have quite that ideological commitment are largely reacting to what they're experiencing, the aggression they're experiencing from both sides. It's a very difficult position for them to be in because, as I said, there's quite a lot of frustration that they're not getting clear instructions of how they should proceed. Then they know that the Arabs are very dissatisfied with immigration and the dispossession, but they're also not really able to address that because the mandate itself is contradictory. So it's very much this chaos in the administration that is frustrating for the administrators and for the officers to not really be able to take over. And you start another real big problem, not just for where the administrators came from, is the fact that, as you said about the quality of the colonial secretaries, there was a high turnover of colonial secretaries and high commissioners during this period. So some of them only hang around for a few years, and particularly during the Arab revolts, control is handed over to the military in order to suppress the revolt. And throughout the mandate itself, you have the Foreign Office, the Colonial Office, the War Office, and the Indian Office all competing for who can control the policy and the mandate. So it's quite chaotic, but I think above all, the administration, whatever they felt to both sides, and that's part of what I'm studying is how they report back what they're witnessing on the ground, and not just what they're reporting, not just what the idea that they are reporting everything 100% accurately. There's the question of how they're getting their intelligence on what is happening, and there's the question of how they're presenting it. One of the interesting things about Sahar Hanidi is writes about the early 1920s and the formation of how the mandate is, the information is coming out of the mandate to inform the government's decisions, saying that there are people in the Middle East section of the colonial officers who are pro-Zionist, who are sort of keeping certain information away from the information they're passing on to the colonial secretary and to the cabinet. So the influence of certain people who aren't necessarily high-ranking is also evident. So trying to untangle that web of different communications, different perspectives, and the general frustration is part of what I'm looking at, and is quite difficult. But again, it's perhaps a boring argument that when all else fails, they secure British interests in the area. They try and protect British institutions, officials, and the strategic position.
Yeah, that's great.
So we'll take people, well, from there, please. Yes, Joy.
Yeah, okay. My name's Sheila.
Oh, Sheila, sorry.
And depending on what you want to call me. I've got two questions, one for both of them actually. So can I just do the one for Adam first? Because that sort of follows on, and then if you don't mind, Sabrina, I'd like to ask you. Okay, Adam, in the work you've done actually in the research to start to do the PhD, have you had any enlightenment as to why originally Britain decided that Palestine was where they wanted to be take over the mandate? Sykes-Picot Agreement 1916 had us sitting down with the French, yes. So, but is there anything, is it the colonial, is there any enlightenment in, say, in the colonial office, that the research you've done so far that sort of points some kind of idea of why Palestine was on their list?
And so, sorry,
Yeah.
may I-
Yeah.
and the second question to Sabrin, so that we move to another, please.
You're looking at the folklore in a way of expressing sort of your historical family history. How difficult was that to actually research? Were you reliant on the members of the family telling you the folklore that was experienced, or were you actually able to go into archives of that period to actually sort of flesh it out? Because as you so rightly said, when you talk to any family member, they're going to differ about certain things. So therefore, how did that work out as regards getting into the folklore?
Thank you, Sheila. Do you prefer? Yeah, there's a question for both, so any of you guys, please.
I've done one, so you can maybe.
Sabrin, come on, we start now.
That's actually a really good question, because I try to approach folklore in many different ways. So I really believe that if you really want to find folklore, you should go among people, because that's where folklore is used and where folklore is changed every day, and it's changed to, to meet the new needs of the population. So the first thing I did was contacting Prof. Sharif Kanana, who is, as I said, one of the greatest experts of Palestinian folklore. He's a really old man, poor guy. He lives in Ramallah. He used to be, he taught all over the world. I met him and I say, okay, where would you start from? And he said, you have to start from people, because that is where folklore is, especially if you want to understand which kind of folklore is still used. The fact is, I got it wrong, because I started from folk tales, so traditional tales. And people don't use traditional folk tales anymore. So many people don't remember them. They think they are stupid, they think they are childish, that they are more important to talk about and not tales. But if you ever been to Palestine, you know that there is something that they love more than anything else, and it is music. So now, if you look at texts of songs, you will find out that a good amount of their songs are actually coming from traditional texts. And traditional folklore and traditional songs and traditional rhymes. So they say that they don't want to talk about folk tales anymore, but they don't talk about it, they sing about it. So when I started to do that, it was listening to music and trying to understand how important it was for an historical context. Another thing, if you go to Palestine, there are a lot of centers for Palestinian folklore. The most important one, who is the biggest one and has the biggest archive, is actually in Ramallah. And I also went through the archive. I'm going back this summer to actually work on the archives, but I need to understand what is still considered important in the narrative of the people. I can't just take a dead text. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So it's good to start from documents and archives, but then you have to talk to people and listen to music and eat the food.
So much knafa though.
Yes.
Hisham,
Thank you.
could I just come back on one point?
Yeah, can we give just can we just give others some space, and we will come back to you if time allows. Sorry about that. Yes, Adam, please.
Okay, so perhaps I don't think there is any more illumination on why outside of what's already been historically argued, but I think the reason for it does become more apparent when you start to consider the situation Britain found itself in. I'd say first of all, as I've said, a lot of different departments were competing for control of Palestine policy, and so when it was originally decided to accept the mandate for Palestine, it was in fact the Foreign Office that was responsible. But the things that come out of it, you can look at Britain's strategic interest in the Middle East. I mean, even though they were allies of the French at the time, they fully expected to go back to competing with them after the war was over. And so they really had no intention, once Sykes-Picot was decided, to really follow through on it. They were going to try and keep more territory away from their Egyptian holdings and from their Indian holdings. One of the interesting things is Britain's biblical interest in Palestine. But what's interesting that I have found coming out of that is there is often this discussion of Christian Zionism going much further back than Jewish Zionism. But the Christians, what's interesting is, because you have a lot of senior figures who accepted the Balfour Declaration, who oversaw this Eastern policy, being in favour and often citing their biblical roots as the reason for this. Throughout much of the 19th century, you find that they were not actually very popular in England. They were regarded as mad. Because there were these very, very strange people who kept on trying to come forward with projects to get the Jews back into Palestine. And what's interesting is they were not particularly liked. But they were taken into consideration, this depth of feeling. I mean, I find actually quite a very interesting parallel to the way the Zionist movement acted when it was in Palestine, trying to keep its ultimate objectives, its ultimate ideas about its discussions about population transfer, about how it forms a state. Very similar to the secrecy that developed within Christian Zionists in British society, who were also regarded as weird, who didn't really fit in to what would say was politically correct at the time. So there's an interesting parallel there. But again, what is really happening at the end of the First World War is that government ministers who are devoting most of their energy into simply conducting the war. I mean, after you go to the peace conferences, most of these people like Balfour and Lord George are exhausted from the last few years of having to manage the wartime policy. So you have big decisions, domestic decisions, and other sort of low-level, longer-term policy considerations being handed down to junior members. And once this all comes, someone has to try and put all of these things together at the end of the First World War. They're simply dealing with all the promises that have been made, dealing with the position that they're left in. And so you have lots of different people coming in and saying, well, Palestine isn't really that strategically important. It's harder to resupply a defensive line on the opposite side of a desert than it is to have the Sinai Desert there as a barrier to Egypt, or that we should preferably have an American control of the mandates rather than a British control of the mandates. So it looks too much like a land grab. So you have all these things then slowly entering into consideration. It is really just the people who were left to make these decisions through informal channels and through personal association that starts to shift this policy. But there is sort of the overlap. One of the common things you hear about the way the Zionist movement was being pitched was that it would be a loyal British Ulster in the Middle East, paralleling Ireland. So you do see, I think that the religious significance was there. It certainly helped. The image of, you have the Crusader image of the British armies taking Jerusalem during World War I. That helps as a propaganda move. And again, it was Lord George who wanted to open this major front in the Middle East in contrast to the Western front. So there is no. You can point to long-term trends and thoughts which I think are important in how Britain viewed the Middle East and its strategic position there. But it's also so many different factors, not least of which, and particularly focusing on these individuals who were taking it upon themselves to form policy during the war, is Britain's own outlook on its empire. This is a point where, from the end of the 19th century, Britain is concerned that it's reached its zenith, that it doesn't have the energy to keep expanding and going forward. And then there are people who are really eager to keep expanding. And so there's really just this confluence of different people, not just different ideas of religion or strategic policy, but different personal emotive issues of the people who are involved in these positions of authority, just shaping it. And as the Colonial Office comes in at the end of the war, and when the Mandate is starting to be formed, they're just, as Churchill takes over, he just says, this is the promises that were made, we have to follow through on it. So it's really the position that partly the position they were left in, and partly just having to show that they had gained something from the war, and then they were left to sort of figure out what was going to happen afterwards.
I don't know if I can add something, and please correct me if I'm wrong. There was also an issue that if France took over Palestine, France was was completely Catholic, and therefore that was not going to be highly accepted by other kind of Christianity.
I think the issue is not that Catholic, is the thought that this is in fact that they were atheists. They were, since the revolution, they were an atheist. Catholicism is associated with France, but it was an atheistic government. They didn't. I think they could have maybe tolerated Catholicism in the lowland, but not that sort of secular attitude.
I see.
And I'm not supposed to intervene, but I will add another thing of almost enlightening, in fact, arguments. And I agree with both of you.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Because building on that, part of what really saw the revival of from rationalism to the resurgence of evangelical Protestantism and Christian Zionism was the French Revolution and the terrors that they saw out of that had an impact on. We saw that a lot of the senior members had that roots in the Christian Zionism and Protestant evangelicalism from the 19th century. This is where they were brought up. So the impact of the French Revolution and what Britain experienced from that period is sort of what's forming their sort of dislike of secular atheism.
Do not.
I don't know. I will add it anyway, because otherwise it's in my chest. There's the other one thing which is added. I think I validated it also with Ilan Pappe, which was Palestine was already promised during the First World War to be given to one of the sons of Hussein ibn Ali, who was an ally of the British, to stand against the Ottomans. And so you stand against us, with us, you help us destroy or dismantle this empire, and you will take, in fact, Jordan, Palestine to King Abdullah, which is the son of the Sheikh. So, and at the same time, it was promised to the Jews. So, so it was something that they agreed upon before even arriving there, that it will be British. So they competed and negotiated. That's the
lots
point.
of different people not really talking to each other. Left to, although Sykes was, even while negotiating with the French, was aware of what he was helping to make the introductions at this point. So it's lots of different. And we don't know what Sykes would have thought.
So that's good on this point. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Sabrin. We will have to move. Sorry, and I intervened. We had the young lady here. Yes.
Thank you. What I wanted to ask, I mean, what you were saying there was a lot of things that there were intentions. It was quite clear that Zionists were intended to expand, and you seem a little bit uncertain about any active hostility against it by any of the old imperialist forces. But what seems to be absolutely the case is that on the ground, the discrimination against the Arab population was there straight away, really, wasn't it? And I mean, how did that come about almost, in its inception, if you like?
Well, one of the interesting, I'll say first of all that yes, there's certainly, the leadership of the Zionist movement were pushing for this. They were separate, but they were employing Arabs certainly in the early part because you simply couldn't avoid it. They didn't have that big of an economic footprint. But certainly with the speeches and sort of the institutions that were formed, there's an awareness that it's taking place, and certainly with the movements, the internal expulsions and displacements that were taking place, that was occurring. But I think one of the things that I don't know a great deal about, but I've seen being slowly discovered, is that the Jewish and the Arab populations who were actually working with each other were actually getting along okay. It took a lot of effort by the Histadrut, the Zionist trade union, and the later Palestinian trade union that formed. They had to work quite hard to get the two populations to disassociate with each other. There's quite a lot of examples of very successful industrial action that each side was taking, and that they did identify with each other quite strongly on occupational grounds rather than nationalist grounds, even at the very height of tensions that were taking place in the early Mandate. And so it wasn't really until the late 1940s that this started to break down.
Right, is that it?
Yeah, yes,
Thank you. But first, Patrick, we'll come back to Helen afterwards. Please.
Just a quick technical thing. You referred to the Churchill White Paper. Can you just clarify what that was?
The Churchill White Paper was a response to the early riots of the Mandate, and it basically clarified what was meant by the Balfour Declaration and the mandatory policy, by saying that they were going to facilitate Jewish immigration as long as there was an economic capacity to absorb them, so they had to be provided with jobs and financed independently by the Jewish population, and it explicitly ruled out that they had the intent of creating a Jewish state that would dominate the Arab population.
And what year was it?
This was
roughly. I mean, roughly.
This is where I completely lose the plot.
Yeah.
Say 1922.
Early 20s.
Yeah. I'm sorry that.
Yeah. So just before the mandate was given.
Yes. This is again. Well, I think it was a little bit after it was because Britain sets up its civil administration and starts practicing it while the mandate is being negotiated, and then it has to wait for it to be ratified. And there's already a High Commissioner present running things. So yeah, I'm sorry. Dates sometimes escape me. So, but yes, sorry, 1922, 1921. And that's either of you can clarify.
I have a history, really, the numbers.
Yes, I'm letting aside.
But we will look for it and we will answer them afterwards. Thank you, Patrick. Thanks, Adam. Helen, please.
Okay, this is one mainly for Sabrin. In the museum, we aim to educate, inform, and communicate the story of Palestine, etc., etc. So I'm just wondering, you maybe have a biased view on this, but wondering how you think an artistic presentation of the story of Palestine, can that have more effect? Is that kind of a better way to get the message out so people understand, rather than sorry, Adam, traditional research where you look at archives or you know.
I'm biased.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm completely biased because one of the reasons why I decided to write a book is because I think Palestine needs human stories. I think, and this is something we talk a lot about with another writer, another Palestinian writer. It's numbers of the people who died will never be as cathartic as one single story expressed in human terms. And I would say there is so much, like Palestinian people are highly artistic people, and there is so much that can be used, that can actually help, even a music video installation will be much more than hundreds of words, honestly. Yeah.
And just a little kind of extra, what do you feel about people who are don't have a Palestinian heritage writing about the story?
Oh wow!
Maybe in a theatre or a film. Or
Not Palestinian, okay. Oh, that's so hard. We had a huge debate recently about misappropriation. I think I'm really divided because in some way I believe that, especially on artistic level, everyone should be free to embody and express stories. Otherwise, we will never, you know, everyone, we will be really sad if you can write just who you are, and we'll cut the empathy out from art. That it's, I think it's all about empathy. But at the same time, Edward Said will tell you that you have to be really attention when you talk about other population, because then you can go in that kind of jungle that is Orientalism. So I would say, yes, non-Palestinian people can write about Palestine as long as they are actually experienced what Palestine is, and they're not just writing from uphill. You see what I mean? They have to go down and then try to write something. And yeah, I'm really, I think I'm still struggling about it, and luckily I'm half Palestinian, because otherwise probably I would have not written this book. That's it.
Thank you. We'll come, yes, Idris, and last, the follow-up question of Sheila, and that's it, I think. All right. Okay, you. We can't discard you. Bath is represented here, so okay. Yes, Idris, please.
Okay, well, first, the question is for Sabrin. First of all, thank you for explaining your PhD subject, because I've actually written, well, not written, but I've copied the paragraph from your website, and I swear I didn't understand what your PhD was about. So thank you for explaining that. Now it makes a lot more sense. No, you've actually explained it quite well, so thank you for that. My question is, so in terms of your book, you said obviously there's a lot of complication in writing non-fictional historical books. Now that you obviously have to obey all these laws, does that mean your book will sort of be limited in some sense? Because you've obviously got to make sure everything's kind of referenced, everything is accurate. And if that is the case, did you actually consider making it fictional, so then you don't have to obey all these historical laws?
Guys, these questions, that can looks like a viva, the final PhD. I'm thinking about switching to fiction every single day. That will make things so much easier. Yes, will be limited in the sense that I'm not going to write anything that is highly controversial. So not controversial, but let's say I can give you a lot of examples. But for example, a really simple thing: no one knows for sure the actual age gap between my grandfather and my grandmother. So they died, so I can't ask them. And birth certificates were not something usual in the past. People even didn't know when they were actually their date of birth. So if I ask my father and his siblings, no one knows the actual age gap. And everyone tells you something different. So for my father, we're 15 years gap, for my aunt was 18 years gap, and for my uncle was 13 years gap, and so on. 5 people, and no one knows exactly. So I'm not going to write about it. And this is just a little thing that doesn't have any historical implication. So can you think about another one that can have big historical implication and also, be a really hard point for Palestinian people, is that during the 67, when the Israeli army entered Bethlehem, many people escaped. And my family didn't. Okay, so some say that they were brave, and some say it's because they didn't have choice. And my uncle was, I think, one of the most honest about it, and he said, I wouldn't like to escape because I didn't feel safe, but my neighbors told me that he would have killed me instead if I leave the house empty. Because as you know, that was one of the tactics of Israeli army. It scares you to death, so you leave the house and they can take the house over and say this is Israeli house. So there is a huge debate between people who left and people who stayed, and why they left and why they stayed. So yeah, I'm going to work really carefully around this kind of stuff, because yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we are running out of time. In fact, we have run out of time. But I will, go to the limits of their generosity and yours to consume 5 extra minutes. Sheila, and then you, please.
Very, very quickly. You said your family was expelled. Do you therefore have difficulty getting back in to do the actual research?
Yeah, my mother was. Quick.
Yeah.
He said quick. My mother was expelled because they never accept the family reunion that my father asked for, even if they were married for 13 years with 3 children, and my mother lived all the time in Palestine. So my mother was expelled, and us with the 3 children, me and my 2 brothers with her, because we were in her passport. My father wasn't expelled, but for the first year he wasn't left. He couldn't come out. So we lived for a lot of years in a distance, and I could go back. We could go back for a short amount of time, but we will never be let in again to live. And between 2000 and 2012, they didn't let us enter at all. When I went back to Palestine for the first time in 2012, at the airport they kept me 5 hours before letting me in. And now every time I go it's the same, but this is quite common for Palestinian people.
Yeah.
So yeah, it had consequences. Yeah.
Thank you, Sabrin.
It was
You,
quite
please.
This is a question for Adam with a nod to Sabrina. It might not be a good question. You might just be able to answer it in one word. I've just been reading my great-uncle's letters that he wrote just before he was killed at Passchendaele. And he was 18 years old. And they've been really eye-opening in how differently people thought, and how hard it is to judge people from 100 years away, because their mindset was just so different. So I'm curious to know, as you've immersed yourself in the British colonial reports and letters, have you found yourself at all kind of not seduced, but starting to see the world through their eyes and being less judgmental and more sympathetic? Or is it still easy for you just to look back and say, oh, the British were appalling what they did?
Well, I don't look back at it like that. I think I look back at it as sort of seeing them as sort of in the same context as administrators. This is the world they live in. They believed they were doing their job. There was not necessarily outside. Obviously, we can look back. Certainly, you can look back 30, 40 years ago and be amazed at the attitudes people possessed. But you look back 100 years and you can accept that there was deep-seated prejudices and ideas that they had against non-European populations. But yeah, for the people who were making these decisions, that they were doing it, obviously the British Empire is not within my living memory, but back then was at its height. So they obviously believed that they were maintaining them strongly. Most of them strongly believed in what they were doing there, even if they didn't get on with the Jews or the Arabs. When the British Mandate was shut down, a lot of people were devastated that they'd spent 30 years here generally believing that they were building the place up and making it better, and to have it all just be unilaterally, we're leaving now, we're throwing it away, it's somebody else's problem. So for the administrators, this is what they believed they were doing. They genuinely believed, but whether they were sympathetic to the Arabs or they were confirmed Zionists, they believed that they had positive feelings about what they were doing.
That answers you's question. Thank you. I've got one announcement and we close. First, let's share and show our appreciation to our both guests. Thank you. The wonderful interventions, talks and stories, and in fact we are looking forward to the book.
Yeah, me too.
And of course and that dissertation.
I'm sure that's
we will get a copy, I promise you we will try that. One last thing, the organizer, thanks again, Idris and Palestine Museum, that this seminar is going to be repeated. It will be an event.
Not with us.
Sad. But so it will be repeated, so it will be done on a regular basis